So it is the copper. Before answering this question, so you need to understand in your mind that we have the electrolyte, that's copper 2 sulfate solution, and have the electrodes, which is the copper electrodes. And if we are talking about the copper electrodes, we mean at the cathode we have the copper cathode, at the anode we have the copper anode. So this is a very simple concept that you need to understand before proceeding with answering this question. So after here, the other thing that you need to understand, it's the formation of the ions. Formation of the ions. And when I'm talking about the formation of the ions, I think you understand that we are talking about the ions that are coming from the electrolyte. Because this electrolyte that we are talking about is going to dissociate. It dissociates because of the presence of the source of power, the source of battery that we have during electrolysis, and the source of energy that we have during electrolysis, the one that is causing the dissociation of ions from the electrolyte that has been given. So since we have the copper 2 sulfate solution, therefore it dissociates to give the ions. So the other thing that you need to understand, which ions are given, which ions are produced from the copper 2 sulfate solution. So that one, it is also a very simple concept. So we are talking about the ions formation. So that is the other thing that is very important for you to understand before proceeding with this question. So the ions formation, which ions are produced by the dissociation of copper 2 sulfate solution? One thing that you need to put in your mind is this, that copper 2 sulfate solution, it means that we have the copper 2 sulfate, but because it is solution, it means that this copper 2 sulfate, it is dissolved in water. So in copper 2 sulfate, there is also water in it. So if there is also water in it, so I think you're not going to be confused if you see I'm writing the ions that will be formed from the copper 2 sulfate solution. It is the copper 2 ions, then you'll be having the sulfate ions, then we'll be having the hydrogen ions and the hydroxyl ions. Hydrogen ion and hydroxyl ions, where are they coming from? Since we have the copper sulfate solution, and from the copper 2 sulfate solution we don't have the hydrogen ion and hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions. It's one of the questions that's very simple for you to understand, that the hydrogen ions and the hydroxyl ions are coming from the water that is in I've said earlier that copper sulfate solution, this copper sulfate solution, it means that this copper 2 sulfate is dissolved in water. So because it is dissolved in water, copper sulfate, it dissociates to give the copper ions and the sulfate ions. That's copper sulfate. But also you'll be having water. That water, water it tends to dissociate. Always water tends to dissociate to give the hydrogen ions and the hydroxyl ions. So in this part of ions formation, now we have 4 ions. The first ion is the copper 2 ion, and we have the sulfate ion, we have the hydrogen ion, and we have the hydroxyl ion. So these are the ions in the concept of the ions formation. After the ions formation, the other thing that's very important for you to understand is to know the ions migration. How the ions migrate, how the ions move from one place to another place, from one side to another side after dissociation, after its formation. So after its formation, the ions, they tend to migrate in the electrolytic cell. So how do they migrate? That is very simple concept as well, because let's write first the ions. We call it the ions migration. So it's the ions migration. So in this ions migration, in this concept of ions migration, what you're going to see is how these ions migrate. After having the ions, the positive, this is the positive charge. We call it the cation, and this is also a positive charge. It's the same as this one, which is a positive charged particle, and this is the positively charged particle. The positively charged particles, they are known as the cations, but here we have the negatively charged particle, and this one it's also the negatively charged particle, because all they are negatively charged particles. Therefore, they are known as the anions. So we have here the anions and we have the cations. So let's see how the cations and anions migrate. That is very simple thing that you want to elaborate to you so that you understand it well.